Cerca. Love the world you live in, and we'll help you explore it. Did you know that the second most visited place in California after Disneyland is Napa Valley? I recently learned that and my mind was blown. Before I got into wine, I used to think that people just went wine tasting in different places because it was something to do. Beautiful place, drinking wine, great photos. Sounds like an amazing vacation, right? It wasn't until my very first wine trip to the south of France in the Languedoc-Roussillon that something just clicked. It was the absolute dead of summer and everything felt hot and dry. And yet there was this ease to this region. Despite the fact that I, too, was hot and sweaty and dry, the lavender grew wild everywhere. And it seemed that just when I thought I couldn't handle any more heat, a wind came through to relieve me. And in that moment, I knew that everything I was feeling, the grapes were feeling too. And you could see that there was a reason these wines tasted the way that they did. They were juicy and ripe and yet still impossibly fresh. Because as much as these sun's intense rays helped the grapes to ripen, the wind was there to help mitigate that. And it was almost like you could smell that lavender in these super juicy ripe wines, and you could feel the ease of this region. And it was like the wine was telling a story as much as the place was. These two things were clearly interconnected. So in the previous episode, I mentioned that there were 4 categories that will always affect the quality, aroma, and the taste of a wine. And we talked about how grapes will always have this identifiable signature marker, this sort of thumbprint that gets carried no matter where that grape is grown. This is why something like a Cabernet tastes a little different than a Pinot, Sauvignon Blanc tastes different than a Chardonnay. More on what those differences are in a later episode. But what about a Chardonnay from the Russian River Valley in Sonoma versus a Chardonnay from somewhere like Meursault in Burgundy? I'm sure you've been to a wine shop before or even seen a wine list that gives you all of these different choices of Chardonnay, and they list all of these different places. What makes those wines different from each other? They're all Chardonnay, right? If we think about Chardonnay as having one of its core components being something like apple, the difference between those places is a lot of times how that apple is translated from place to place. So for example, in somewhere like Burgundy, that apple might be a little bit more like a Granny Smith, a tart apple, something that has really great acidity. But when we take that Chardonnay and we move it to somewhere warmer, like that of the Russian River Valley, that apple goes from Granny Smith to something like a Golden Delicious. Maybe it's even baked into a pie and has this really ripe characteristic about it. 99% of the wines that you see on the shelves out and about will always tell you the origin of where those grapes are grown. That's the region that you see on that label. And I'm sure you've seen this before, right? You've been in a store, you look at the label, and all it says is Bordeaux. It doesn't tell you the grape variety. It doesn't tell you it's Cabernet or Merlot. And that is not an accident. That's intentional. Europe believes that place is incredibly important, so much so that they protect the regions that these grapes are grown and only allow you to identify them by their region. So as a consumer, it's sort of up to you to know that that blend in that Bordeaux is usually something like Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Malbec, Cabernet Franc, and usually a blend of that. But this is a great example of where origin is almost more important than the actual grapes that are inside the bottle. Now, as frustrating as it might be for those of you who don't know that Bordeaux is those grapes, the nice thing is that when you're talking about labels like that, it actually is giving you a ton of information. You just have to know how to dissect it. But before we get into breaking down labels and how to dissect it from place to place, let's talk about what the core of all of this is, which is terroir. Now, the French will tell you that there is no English translation for terroir, and technically, they would be right in saying that. We don't have a word, and instead, we have adopted theirs, but it is explainable, and as a native Philadelphian, I've sort of come up with a little analogy to help. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and every summer, my family would drive to the Jersey Shore to visit our grandparents and head to the beach. Without fail, we would stop about halfway through our short little 2-hour drive at the produce stand to get tomatoes. And no, we could not go to just any produce stand. There was a particular one that my mom insisted on going to every single time, without fail. Now, why couldn't we just get tomatoes at our local giant in Pennsylvania, or even, I don't know, stop at the produce stand that was literally 1 mile before? Because where those tomatoes were grown resulted in better tomatoes. They were juicier, they were sweeter, they had a perfect density to them. And that had everything to do with terroir, or where those tomatoes were grown. We can explain terroir sort of as Mother Nature's influence on commodities like grapes, which can include everything from soil types to weather patterns, basically everything man can't affect. So we're not talking about whether the wine was aged in oak. We're not even talking about grape variety. We're literally talking about all of the things that go into what comes up out of the ground. And I'm sure you've dealt with this at home, even in your own backyard with some of your flowers, or maybe you have apple trees, something that grows as a result of Mother Nature. And you've seen from year to year how that can be affected by the different weather, how if you use a little bit more fertilizer or maybe you till too much, it can actually change how whatever it is you're growing will come up out of the ground. And the same goes for grapes. Grapes are inherently going to be affected by their place, or as we're calling it today, terroir. So what does that mean for wine? We can sort of break it down into 2 general categories to start. And I'm going to use a few terms that I think are going to come up as you travel the world or even just drink at home. Warm climate and cool climate, old world and new world. I should sort of caveat that old world and new world have gotten a little bit tricky to use because the lines have been blurred a little bit as of late, but we've often identified old world as being a little bit more on the cool side, new world being a little bit more on the warm side. That's not necessarily what that means, but I do think it's handy to have all of those pieces of information in your arsenal. Old world, for all intents and purposes, is basically anything in Europe. So France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, those are your old world regions. New world is North America, so California, Oregon, even Canada, South America, so Argentina, Chile, and it even ventures on over to Australia, which ask any Australian and they're still pretty upset about the fact that they are still being labeled as New World because they've been producing wine for a pretty long time. But it's important to know those differences as you're going through that because it may come up. Warm climate and cool climate, I think we can probably figure out what that means, but warm climate wines are going to be wines that are produced in warmer regions. Cool climate wines are wines that are produced in cooler regions. Now, to go back to my earlier tomato analogy, I think most of us can probably imagine how fruit tastes when the weather gets super hot, right? The fruit is much sweeter, it's riper, and if it gets too hot, it can even shrivel in the vine. Grapes behave like most other fruits in this way. During the growing season, the grape will start to develop both physiologically, so that's your skins, your seeds, your stems, and it will also start to develop in sugar. Now, remember, we need enough sugar in the grape to convert to our desired potential alcohol in the wine. So let's go back to fermentation 101 for just a second, right? So in order to create alcohol, we start with grapes. That's going to be your sugar. We're going to add yeast. and the yeast is going to eat the sugar, converting that to alcohol with a little bit of CO2 in the end. So if you don't have enough sugar to start, you can't get to that desired level of potential alcohol. Make sense? Ideally, these two phases of development would happen at about the same time, right? Complete development of the grape concluding at the same time as the desired sugar levels. We've basically matured as humans, and we also have enough sweetness to do what we got to do to convert to alcohol. But the likelihood of that happening at the same time is incredibly rare. Phenolic development, or physiological development, however you want to call it, doesn't usually happen at the same rate as the sugar levels rising. And the way that we talk about sugar levels rising is in what's called degrees Brix. That's BRIX for those of you who are thinking about building houses, different bricks. Your degrees Brix is what all of the winemakers are going to be looking at to determine whether or not those grapes are ready to be picked. But of course, they also need to make sure that those skins are fully developed because that's where all the flavor is coming from. And they also need to make sure that those seeds aren't going to be green, as well as the stems. So they're looking for both. And even though they're not happening necessarily in tandem, they're sort of weighing the pros and cons to make sure that they are harvesting at optimal ripeness for both. So let's say you're visiting a wine region and you're in California in the Northern Hemisphere, and harvest is just starting to get underway in August, September. You're going to see all of these winemakers out and about, not only measuring the bricks, but also tasting these grapes. And that's super important because they want to make sure that there's flavor development there, which is your physiological development, as well as sugar levels. That's going to play directly into how that wine's going to taste, as well as the quality. So if you find yourself in a region and you're talking to a winemaker during harvest, those are really fun questions to ask about how they determine whether or not the grape is ready for harvesting. Do they taste the grapes? What are they measuring in terms of bricks to make sure that it's ready? These are all really fun questions to help you geek out a little bit as you're traveling to different wine regions. So as we back up to warm climate and cool climate, let's talk a little bit about what those different things can mean. When we're talking about warm climates, so we'll go back to this example of California, which in the northern parts can be very warm, as well as in the southern parts, you tend to have these really ripe flavors. More sun exposure, the temperatures are hotter, you're gonna have these flavors that are gonna be more on the ripe side. I used the Russian River Valley Chardonnay as the example earlier as these apples that are gonna taste like they're baked into a pie. That's a great example of a warm climate wine. These flavors are gonna be a little bit more robust, they're gonna be riper, they're gonna be juicier. It doesn't necessarily mean that the wine is gonna be sweet, it just means that those flavors are gonna be riper. And we actually call that something called perceived sweetness. So if you feel like you're getting sweetness in a wine, it's highly unlikely. It's just your brain tricking you, because as you're tasting that and maybe you're getting this sweet peach flavor, your brain tricks you into thinking that there's actually sugar there. For cool climate, it's almost the opposite. You're still gonna have obviously ripe fruit, but the quality of that fruit is gonna be a little bit more on the tart side. I use that example of Chardonnay and Burgundy as being a little bit more on the Granny Smith side of apples. So think of tart fruit, so slightly underripe, but still kind of teetering on the edge. Those wines usually have really great acidity. They also tend to be a little bit lower in alcohol because those sugar levels have a harder time of increasing due to the fact that it's lower sun exposure. But of course, our wines are not just relegated to those two categories of warm climate, cool climate. There's a lot of nuances in between there. Oceans can play a huge influence on how wines will taste because of how they affect the grape growing season. Soil is another huge category to talk about, and as you visit from place to place and we dive into different regions, we will definitely be talking about how different soils can affect how wines will taste. For example, if you happen to go to Germany in the Mosel region, you're definitely going to be talking about slate. Blue slate everywhere that affects how that Riesling's going to taste. In places like Champagne, you're going to be talking about those chalky soils. You might talk about limestone in Burgundy, and in California, especially in places like Napa Valley, where you've got 50% of the world's soil orders, you're going to be talking about a lot of different soils there and how different places, even within a mile of each other, can be vastly different because of how those soils can vary. These are all huge things to pay attention to, and you should also notice if you're traveling, if the wines mimic those places in any way. For me, when I was in the Languedoc, there was sort of a relaxed nature to these wines. There was an energy that almost matched the place. This is also sort of a less easy way to quantify terroir, but also something that I think plays a huge role. So a lot of times these places, this energy, whatever you want to call it, that can also be a huge factor into how these wines will taste, and that does fall into the category of terroir. Last but not least, we definitely want to talk about farming because that does play a huge role in terroir, right? How you actually farm these lands that the grapes are going to be grown in matters. So a lot of wineries and vineyards have started moving towards organic, even biodynamic, regenerative farming. These are all really important things to pay attention to as you're visiting different regions. If they're farming conventionally, it doesn't mean that the wines are bad, but a lot of times you'll see winemakers and vintners move towards a more sustainable or eco-friendly way of farming because it is inherently better for the grapes, and that does tend to make better wine. Terroir is a real thing, and I have to be honest, I'm not sure that I fully believed it until I started visiting these regions. It really started to sink into me when I visited the Languedoc and when I moved out to Napa Valley and I started seeing how all of these things could influence how wines would taste from year to year. Different vintages present different things and new challenges for the winemakers, and we have to work with Mother Nature, not against it. So that is going to play a huge role in how these wines will taste. In fact, winemakers say 99% of winemaking actually happens in the vineyard. This is why when you're out and about at the wineries and you see these winemakers not in there doing your tastings with you, that's because they're out roaming the land. They're tasting the grapes. They're cutting back different leaves. They're making sure that they are managing Mother Nature as best they can because they know how much of an influence that's going to have on the resulting wine. So, to recap a little bit, warm climate, right? We're talking about riper flavors, potentially higher alcohols, usually a little bit of a juicier side of wine. Cool climate, that's going to be your more savory tones, higher acid, potentially lower alcohol. You also have your soils to contend with, you have ocean influences, and you have all of these energies that I talked about, right? This goes back to me being in the Languedoc, feeling this sort of relaxed energy, this sort of like laissez-faire thing going on. And so these are all things that when you are visiting, you should be thinking about. You should be a detective with your senses. Notice everything around you, how the temperature changes throughout the day from morning to night. I'm here in Napa where in the morning it could be 50, 60 degrees, and by the afternoon it could be 85 degrees. These are huge things that you should definitely pay attention to and sort of imprint in your mind. If there's this constant wind going on, raise your hand, ask the question, is this wind normal? Do you guys usually have this? That's a really good piece of information to have on hand for later. You should also notice what smells are in the air. I noticed the lavender when I was in the Languedoc. Sometimes when I'm in Italy, especially in that of Tuscany, I get all these like herbs and spices, a lot of sage going on. And in California, there's so much rosemary here, it grows almost wild along with the eucalyptus trees. So a lot of times those can permeate the wines in a weird sort of Mother Nature way that we don't fully understand. You should also be noticing what the dirt looks like in the vineyard. How does the footprint of your feet in the dirt look? Sometimes they're more sandy, sometimes you're not making any imprint at all. Those are all things that I think are really easy to observe and easy to make the connections with as you're going from vineyard to glass, especially if you're in the actual place. All of these things really help to not only paint a complete picture of the place, but also they help to solidify the memory. When you're trying to recall wines down the road, you're going to be incredibly shocked to see how much those things come back to you. Even, and I love her so much, my mom, who has a really hard time separating wines from each other, remembers certain wines because of the place that we had them. She remembers some of the soils that were there and how some of this dirt actually stained her shoes, and it comes back to her in that moment. I think those are all memories that we can easily create and easily keep these memories with us as we're drinking wine. Other questions to ask and things to ponder, you should definitely be asking what elements make farming this vineyard challenging. Mother Nature is not always the kindest to us in the agricultural world. From year to year, things can change pretty dramatically. This is why we have the vintage on the bottle, because we want to know what happened in that particular year to make the wine taste like what it did. And so as we go to these places and we start to learn more about these wineries, it's important that you ask what those challenges are from year to year, because they tend to be more consistent than not. The other thing you should definitely be asking if you're not observing it yourself are what are some of the soil types you might find, and do they vary across the vineyard? Just because you're maybe walking along a dirt path somewhere doesn't mean that that dirt is going to be consistent from place to place across the entire vineyard. Even from row to row, we can see a huge change in what those soils do. And you'll notice when you're at the wineries and tasting wines, a lot of those wines are broken down even by lot. So vineyard to vineyard, lot to lot, these sub-parcels can have a huge difference from place to place. So those are always things to pay attention to. And then, of course, how do you farm your vineyard? Now, try not to be too judgy here. We all want to get to organic, more sustainable farming. That is most of the time going to be the goal. And many wineries have already moved to more sustainable and environmentally friendly practices, but some aren't quite there yet. This is a good time to learn more about what those pressures and challenges are that they face that might prevent that. Most of the time, they're working towards it. And some places actually choose to practice that they just don't seek certification or make a big deal out of it because it's just the right thing to do as far as they're concerned. All right, now that you have tackled what this word terroir means and how all of these different elements can play into the glass, what I need you to do is be a detective with your senses. What does that mean? Open your eyes, turn on your nose, and even notice how you're feeling as you're walking through your day, what the world is doing to you and how it's making you feel. And what I mean by this is you should be noticing how things smell. You should notice if there's something in the air that you maybe didn't notice before. You should look around and see if there's certain plants growing in certain places that you maybe didn't notice. You should also be noticing how that sun feels on your skin or how that wind is affecting you. Did you need to put a jacket on that day? And if you did, was it at a certain time every single time of day? These are all things that play into terroir, and we can experience them as humans even before we sit down with the glass. Because if we do that, that's going to help you make that connection like I just talked about. In the meantime, here's something that you can actually do at home. Start making memories with your senses. It's amazing how much we don't link the words to what we're smelling. So if you're smelling your coffee in the morning, maybe just as it's being ground, stick your nose in there and just say coffee out loud. If you're out gardening and you smell a particular flower, same thing. Notice what those words are and start making that association. The other thing that I would love for you to do as you're maybe tasting some of these wines is research a little bit about that region. Look up to see if there's a particular soil type, if there's a weather pattern that's really unique to there, and start making those associations long before you ever visit. The sooner you can do that, the better off you're going to be. So you're going to associate some of those smells and flavors with where that wine has been grown. I hope you enjoyed wine tripping with me. Throughout this series, I'll be taking you on a guided tour of some of the best wine-producing regions in the world, like Tuscany, Napa, Portugal, and many more. Plus, teaching you how to really understand what goes into making the wines you're sipping and how to best appreciate it. And of course, I'll be suggesting some of my favorites for you to try. You can listen to Wine Tripping with Amanda McCrossin on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or download the Cerca app, where you'll find an incredible array of city and country guides, travel podcasts, and more. Visit cercatravel.com, spelled C-E-R-C-A. Cerca, love the world you live in, and we'll help you explore it.